All right. I am now joined by Emerson Green, who is a first-time guest on the YouTube channel, though he has been on the Collins Show. How are you doing, Emerson?
Good. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So, I thought you might be an interesting person to do this with. We haven't done a Hitchens debate here in a little while, um, and it is one of the wells we like to go back to. And since you're somebody who I know is interested in, atheism and philosophy of religion and all of that, thought it might be a good one for you. So I should say, um, like I watched a bunch of these. I wrote a book about Hitchens, order link in the description. Um, but I wrote about a bunch of these in the book. This isn't one of the ones that I included, but I definitely did watch it. I think when I was researching it, and it's just a little bit of a fun reversal because the debate question is, Hitchens's book is God is not great, how religion poisons everything, and the debate question is, does atheism poison everything? Any kind of opening thoughts about any of this, the debate itself, Hitchens, Berlinsky, any of that stuff before we get started?
Yeah, I mean, this is not typically the kind of thing that I engage with. I'm sort of more
Mm-hmm.
interested in, philosophy of religion,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, and, new atheism is, more concerned with like the socio-political, cultural effects
Mm-hmm.
of fundamentalism in particular. So I'm not against, the activist side of things, but I just happen to be more interested in the philosophy of religion. And, it came up a little bit in this debate. I kind of skipped around in preparation, and I looked into this Berlinsky guy who apparently is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. And I do love talking about intelligent design. Sadly, it doesn't come up that much in this debate, it doesn't seem. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting that he wants to defend this proposition or this motion, because from what I can tell, he's not personally religious. He doesn't like
Mm-hmm.
engage in any religious practice or have religious experiences, but he's still a defender of religion. But yeah, it's
Well,
it's a it's a fun debate, I think, overall. And we do have the Chrome Dome Hitchens in this one.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny actually, because to connect two parts of what you just said, it's certainly um, like the fact that Berlinsky is not personally religious in a weird way makes this more interesting to me, because he's making the kind of argument that I feel like a lot of conservative intellectuals make with sort of different degrees of obviousness or self-awareness, maybe, right? Which is that like this would be a little bit of a caricature, but I think only a little bit. Right? It's like, well, who knows if this is right, but you should totally believe it, because that's going to be better for social order.
Yeah, kind of the Jordan Peterson thing. He kind of perfected the obscurantism there. But as far as I can tell, he is some kind of atheist, who just thinks that
Mhm.
religion is necessary.
Yeah, or at the very least, he's not. Yeah, it doesn't come from a deep well of religious feeling on his part. And yeah, so this is whether or not he's an atheist exactly. Yeah, I mean, as you say, this is definitely the Jordan Peterson thing. In fact, this is credit where credit's due. I think it was Stefan Bertrand Lee who I was talking to on this Ablation YouTube channel. I don't remember exactly, a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about Jordan Peterson, and particularly the way Jordan Peterson makes use of and talks about Nietzsche, which I expressed not for the first time some confusion about, right? Because it's like, well, he seems to be super duper into Nietzsche, but like, Peterson seems to think Christianity is a good thing, right? So what's going on there? Uh, and uh, and and what they said, what Stefan said is, well, the key is that it's like Peterson almost treats it as if Nietzsche is like saying like, oh, the death of God, whatever, like is like a thing that's going to happen, culturally, sociologically, but that's bad, right? You know, that
Yeah.
like it's like a warning instead of a celebration. And I've got to say, right, since they said that, I've been thinking it's like, oh, all right, now I get it, right? You know, like now I get what he's saying. You know, when he constantly brings up Nietzsche, and you know, and again, I think this is not an uncommon move for a certain kind of conservative intellectual to make, right? I mean, like I remember even like reading many years ago Leon Trotsky's like autobiography. I think it's called My Life. I might be wrong about that, but anyway, he just has this in passage story here about like being a kid. It's like some, or I don't know, maybe he was like 18 or something, but like some czarist, like minor state official, sort of casually admitted to him, it's like, look, I've read Darwin. I know, I know this is all bullshit, but like, you know, it's good for the people, you know, to have a religion, and you know,
Hmm.
this is something that like I think there are slightly different ways you could make the move. You know, like I think like well, Christopher Hitchens' brother, who's still alive, Peter Hitchens, sort of does a version of this in his book, The Rage Against God. But it's sort of in that sense, it's like, well, it's good to believe this for that reason. Therefore, I'm gonna like, you know, take a leap of faith and make myself believe it. Right. You know, that's like one version of it, you know, but and then maybe it like sort of shades into more cynical versions.
Yeah, I forgot about that whole sort of elitism of like, well, the common people need it. We don't need it because we're enlightened and intelligent. But yeah, I've just never really shared that intuition. I guess I think people can handle it. um, if atheism isn't true, then
Sure.
obviously it might. But yeah, I don't have that sort of anti-egalitarian sentiment. I guess that like, we need to give noble lies, we need to
Yeah.
spread those for like the commoners. And then, because I feel like Berlinsky might be sort of one of those people because he doesn't seem to personally believe it, but he still thinks atheism poisons everything.
Yeah, I'm not totally clear. Now, you might have watched this more recently than I have, right? So you might have a better idea, right? I'm not totally clear whether he's like, you know, not religious, but is like sort of vaguely a theist, or he's and like yay religion, or like whether you know, or whether like he has like a more openly cynical position than that. Maybe it'll get clearer in the debate as we watch.
I watched a bit of an interview with him and Ben Shapiro. It was a real meeting of intellectual giants, and he was just saying how he's almost like a I don't want to just throw this word around because everyone does, but like fascist, like it doesn't seem totally inappropriate with him. Like he actually has some pretty bizarre beliefs, and like Ben Shapiro, who is at least nominally like a libertarian, where he at least defends his view of the world using libertarian principles at least some of the time. He
Yeah.
was trying to defend these kind of common sense libertarian principles, and like Berlinsky was just straightforwardly rejecting them. Not like, oh, the real libertarian position is this. He's just like, no, I don't care about that. It was actually
Yeah.
kind of interesting, but yeah, I think that he does have like a pretty straightforwardly elitist view. So I wouldn't really expect him to be honest if he was an atheist, but just thought it was good. But in that interview, he seemed to express like, I'm not an atheist. I do believe in God. I just don't. It's not very fervent, and I don't have any religious practice, and I've never had a religious experience, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, right. Which I guess could, I mean, on the one hand, it's like, look, could you be a, you know, could you be intellectually convinced of theism, but not like feel the emotional draw of religiosity? I get, you know, you could. On the other hand, at a certain point, like it does kind of ping some radar, like, okay, so I'm not going to go to church. I'm not going to act on this in any way, right? But just trust me. Like I really do think this is all right.
I think it's true, and it has no discernible impact on my behavior or my life. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, let's with that. I guess let's get started. I should say, by the way, since I didn't say it when I first introduced you, that you're the host of Walden Pod and also the Counter Apologetics podcast. People can check those out. But let's get going.
Good evening. I'm Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, and we welcome you to tonight's debate. The resolution being debated this evening is Atheism Poisons Everything. Now, again, this is the resolution. This is the question being discussed. It is, of course, a play on the title to Christopher Hitchens' best-selling book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Arguing the affirmative of the resolution is Dr. David Berlinski, a scientist, professor of mathematics, and author of many books, most notably The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, which is available in the lobby, and afterwards there will be a book signing, so you'll have the opportunity to meet Dr. Berlinsky. Arguing the negative of the resolution is Christopher Hitchens, journalist, cultural critic, and best-selling author, and most recently he is the author of the memoir, Hitch 22. This is also a bestseller. It's also available in the lobby, and you will have the same opportunity to meet Christopher Hitchens and to have your book signed by him. Now, just a bit about the format for tonight's debate. First of all, there will be 12-minute opening statements by each of these men. Dr. Berlinsky will be the first to speak, and then, of course, Christopher Hitchens. Then we will have a rebuttal of 6 minutes each, and then a speaker recap. That is to say, some final remarks for that portion of the debate, 3 minutes each. Now, I will be timekeeping as we move along, and I'm asking these gentlemen not to trample those time limits. And then we will move into a question and answer time. I have some questions here which have been submitted, and I will read them to the two of them, and then I will signal them at the end when they have received their last question that they should then give some sort of closing statement. And since Dr. Berlinsky is going first, he will have the opportunity to go last. So that being the case, we will now begin our debate. And Dr. David Berlinsky, please open for us.
Thank you all very much for being here.
Oh, did you unmute yourself because you wanted to throw something in?
Oh, no, sorry.
I would like to thank Larry Taunton and the Fixed Point Foundation for their outstanding hospitality. And,
I love how he just doesn't know how to handle it.
Hitchens, Landsman,
Yeah.
my pleasure of being allowed to bask in the radiance of his reputation.
Feel like
and L'chaim.
Hitchens would have been able to do something with that.
You got to say something to break the awkward silence.
Atheism poisons everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm perfectly aware, and you should be too, that that proposition is fully compatible with the proposition that religion poisons something. Were Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins tomorrow to announce that they were prepared to invade hell in order to roust a variety of pederastic priests, I would wish them well, although for reasons of personal inconvenience, I could not join them. In some respects, as Dr. Johnson once said, the proposition that atheism poisons everything hardly requires a defense. The inquiry is not needed, he said. The last date at which atheism was a possibility in social thought was also the last date in which it was a plausibility in social thought. I ask you to cast your mind back, around 1790, 1791 in France, Paris, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And standing there, somewhat elaborated by my historical imagination, is Robespierre, reed, thin, narrow, green-eyed, fanatical, rabid as a bat, and Danton, large, boisterous, remarkably eloquent. And they're watching, or they're looking at Notre Dame, and one guy says to the other, "What should we do with this pile of Gothic junk?" And the answer is, let's rename it. Good idea. What should we call it? Each man was hoping they would call it after themselves, but that was not to be. And Robespierre came up with a wonderful idea, we'll call it the Temple of Reason. Good thinking, his companion said. The Temple of Reason, that works splendidly. It means nothing, but it works splendidly. We might as well have called it the Temple of Evidence, Temple of Rationality. What should we do next, was the question. And the inevitable answer, the answer known from historical circumstances, well, let's go out and kill a whole lot of people. And that's exactly what they did. Once they had renamed Notre Dame the Temple of Reason, it was relatively easy to go out and kill 50,000 innocent men, women, and children. That, I submit to you, is the nature of the proposition we are discussing. 1851, 60 or 70 years later, an age of remarkable progress, enlightenment, wonderful sense of dawning material possibility. Matthew Arnold, in a poem entitled Dover Beach, reflected on the decline of religious faith in Europe, the melancholy, long withdrawing raw. He didn't see anything particularly optimistic in that withdrawal. And he could think to say to himself and to his readers only this, ah, my beloved, let us be true to one another. My beloved, true to one another. For the world which lies about us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath neither really joy, nor light, nor love, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain, and we are caught as on a darkling plain, swept by confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. This is a prophetic declaration from the heart of the progressive, enlightened 19th century. In 1914, surveying the carnage that was to come, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain said, again prophetically, the lights are going out all over Europe. The lights, what a strange word. We shall not see them lit again in our time. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the 20th century was a record in Germany, in Russia, in China, in Cambodia, and elsewhere, not only of remarkable stupidity, brutality, and violence, but of unparalleled brutality, stupidity, and violence. And each of the regimes behind this remarkable decay of civilization had two features in common, two characteristics we should bear in mind. In the first place, the men guiding these regimes and their entourage did not believe for a moment there was any power higher than their own. And they acted on that assumption. And in the second place, in the mass murders they conducted, they were aided and supported by any number of crackpot scientific disciplines. That makes for a characteristic combination. In the case of the Nazis, the scientific disciplines were derived from biology, and especially from Darwinian biology. In 1937, having murdered 70,000 handicapped men, women, and children, the Nazis released a film, and on the background of the film, the narrator says in terms of solemn incomprehension, my goodness, we have sinned against the law of natural selection. The law of natural selection. What could that mean? We have sinned against the law of natural selection. The communists, of course, had an equally crackpot theory that they derived from Marxian economics, the two crackpotteries joining in one deeply repugnant stream. As all of you know, atheism today is not simply the private doctrine of a handful of individuals. It's become a social movement. And as a social movement, it has been advanced chiefly by the scientific community, certainly in the United States, but to a large extent in Europe too. Some of this is adventitious. A few popular writers, such as Richard Dawkins, discovered that by writing books indicating that science has shown that God does not exist, well, they could make a fortune. I'm very sorry I wasn't there to join them. I didn't think of it at the time. I'm quite sure that someone now is writing a book how margarine science shows that God does not exist. But the inevitable consequences of this degree of atheism within the scientific community has involved a deformation of scientific thought, quite striking in its character and its extent. After all, the sciences, if we restrict our attention to the serious sciences, and those may be found in mathematics or in mathematical physics in no other place, then we must recognize that the serious sciences have nothing to say about the existence of God, either in their premises or in their conclusion. What a remarkable fact. People are writing books how physics shows that God does not exist, but physics has nothing to say about the existence of God. The aching questions that trouble the human imagination, about which the sciences, when seriously considered, are resolutely silent, these remain just where they were. And the religious tradition, especially the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, has offered a coherent body of belief and doctrine by which they can be explained. Do we understand why the universe arose 14 million? No, we don't. Do we understand why it's there at all? No, we have no idea. Do we understand how life emerged on Earth? Not a prayer right now. Do we understand the complexity of life? We can't even begin to describe a living creature in anything resembling precise terms. Recent article in Science Digest, cell division requires 4,000 coordinated proteins acting together. What a remarkable statement. What a wealth of information we possess about biology. What an abundant lack of understanding we have about living systems. Do we understand why the laws of nature are true? No, we have no idea. Do we understand the miracle of analytic continuation in physics when certain kinds of functions can be pushed forward into the future contrary to all experience? Do we understand why the universe remains stable from moment to moment? The medievals pondered this question, ladies and gentlemen, and they came to the conclusion, and I quote a medieval theologian, that God is everywhere conserving the world. What a remarkable declaration. Can we do without it? Can we do without it? Do we have an explanation for the continuity and stability of the universe? There is one paper that I know in the literature by Freeman Dyson that addresses the stability of matter. But beyond that, everything is enigmatic. How can we propose
can we pause for a moment there?
to rule out of court in
That is a pretty shocking admission of ignorance on his part, if I take it at face value. Like, that he seems to think that no one has addressed the problem of induction except for Freeman Dyson in one paper. That's a pretty bizarre statement, honestly. Like, I mean, he does seem to be saying that. I mean, maybe he's saying no one's had a convincing discussion of induction beyond the Dyson guy. But
I will also say, so I mean, while we're paused for the last few minutes, I not very well, and certainly without articulating the structure of the arguments very quickly, but very well, right? But like he has kind of shifted gears from this, like, atheism is going to make everybody a murderous Jacobin argument to actually doing some philosophy of religion and saying, like, well, I mean, certainly his, like, there are a lot of declarations of all the things that he thinks that science is ignorant about, because the only mathematics and mathematical physics are the only thing he'll accept as serious science. No biology, no chemistry, none of that. But like, in the discussion about the stability of the universe, right? Why it continues to exist from moment to moment. He put it in a weird way, but it sure sounded like he was saying that the best explanation of that is that there's a all-powerful God who's like willing it to continue to exist from moment to moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounded like he was confusing like 2 or maybe 3 issues. I'm not sure. Like, yeah, one thing he might have been talking about is existential inertia, which is just why anything continues to exist, or like, is it possible for things to continue in existence without God sustaining them, like without some kind of sustaining cause? It sounded like he might have been talking about that, but it also sounded like he was talking about sort of the stability of matter, like as in just regularity. Like, why don't the laws of nature completely change for every moment of existence? And, so, I mean, those are 2 separate issues, but it seemed like he was conflating them maybe. But either way, he seems to think that God is a convincing explanation of why the laws of nature remained fixed, at least for long chapters of the universe's history, and also seems to just be rejecting any notion of existential inertia, like there has to be a God who sustains everything in existence at all moments. Not a very, I mean, he just is kind of saying it. He's not really offering any reasons supporting that particular claim, but
Yeah, I mean, it's almost not worth it, but I mean, I guess I will just say, like, okay, um, so his bar for evidence is high enough that, um, I mean, it sounds like he's just like sweepingly rejecting all of modern biology and like several other sciences also. But at the same time, he'll accept God did it as, like an adequate explanation, right? I mean, because the way he framed it was, well, this remarkable statement by this medieval theologian is, God did it. Can we do without that? Right. So it's like, okay, but like, is that actually like, why does that count as an adequate explanation? Whereas like some scientific theory that maybe you can't have absolute certainty about, but, certainly, coheres well with all of our evidence and has explanatory power and et cetera, is not.
yeah, I mean, he doesn't consider any alternatives. He doesn't explain, like, okay, let's consider, some of the responses to this idea that God needs to be the sustaining, force in all of existence. Like, he doesn't even acknowledge that people have talked about that, or that many theists don't adopt that particular argument. Like that argument has been around for a long time, and many theists are not convinced by it. Like not all theists believe that God is sustaining everything in existence at all moments. Like many theists will go along with the, I mean, like I want to say atheistic critiques, but really it's just philosophical critiques of those kinds of arguments. And yeah, they think that rocks can continue existing without God sustaining them in existence. And he, Berlinsky seems to think that we can't do without a God who's sustaining things moment to moment. That rocks would not just keep existing if it weren't for God making it the case.
Well, as was pointed out in the chat, I mean, or at least the point was made in the chat to put it slightly differently. I mean, there is a sort of internal theistic even reason to think that there's something funny about that account, right? I mean, that like you're talking, so are you saying there's a designer who can't put things together well enough that, that they won't like just um, explode at any moment? That, that you're not like, specifically engaged in an active will to keep them together?
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and there's just I'm still kind of annoyed by his saying that like matter being kind of predictable is just like, that just stumps atheists. We've never thought about this. We've never considered this. There's no answer, and also there's a theistic answer. I mean, that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is when people present things as like, well, here's the theistic answer to this, and here's the atheistic answer to this, and it's very rare that there are dividing lines that are like that. There are theists and atheists on both sides of pretty much every issue.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think so, right? Because there are like a bunch of things you could say about all of these that would be compatible with either thinking or not thinking. That
Yeah.
there's a God. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So I mean, he's done this sort of, well, science isn't perfect, therefore you should just accept the sentence God did it as an adequate, like the best explanation of the table so far. Again, as far as I can tell, that was the argument just now. So that's the atheism is false argument. But where he started was the if atheism is true, that would be horrible argument, which is, it's, I think, better to keep those two analytically much more separate than he is, but like is also, as I think with a lot of things, right? That like, I think it's maybe like a question's worth independently thinking about, right? I mean, it's like the same way that if you're, I don't know, talking about like free will and determinism, right? It's worth at some point in the discussion, like taking a beat to think about how bad it would be or not be, as the case might be,
Right.
if there's no free will. And as far as I could tell, the argument was, well, Robespierre, Hitler, Stalin, and much like actually the science can't explain how the universe doesn't blow up from moment to moment without God argument. The obvious objection is that he's only considering one side of the ledger, right? These are even if his historical premises were all correct, which they are not, right? Like that he's only considering, it's like, okay, here are the bad things that atheists in power have done, but surely we'd have to compare that, to the bad things that, theists in power have done before we could even start to think about, right? Drawing any conclusions about from this, which, I assume Hitchens will get into this, so we don't need to, rattle it off, but right, it's a long list. And, in particular, like with the example he started with, I don't know. I listened to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. I listened to the French Revolution, season of that. A factoid that Duncan mentions very quickly and doesn't dwell on nearly as long as I thought he should have, honestly, is like, okay, but in Poland in like the 1790s, there was a attempt by local Jacobin sympathizers to have an imitation revolution there, and like more people were killed in the counter-revolutionary terror, crushing that, than were killed in all of the revolutionary terror in France, which certainly doesn't like morally excuse the latter, but it does, but it is like pretty relevant, right? Because like I'm pretty sure that the people carrying out the White Terror in Poland were extremely devout Catholics, and also like it is worth mentioning maybe that Robespierre, Hitler, Stalin, only one of those guys was actually an atheist. Right, Joseph Stalin, and I'm perfectly happy to say he was in fact an atheist. Hitchens in his book sort of goes through some weird contortions to get out of having to sort of accept that, which I think is silly, but like at the same time, but like again, Hitler, nope, was into all kinds of like weird mystical stuff. And Robespierre, nope, right? Like, and in fact, the way he presented this was kind of slippery at the beginning, right? Because he's talking about the Notre Dame Cathedral being
renamed the Temple of Reason or something.
Yeah. And so the way he presents the story, it's like, well, they did that, then they could kill all these people. It's like, okay, for one thing, I'm pretty sure there were executions going on left. I guess I'm not certain about this. I'd have to check, but I would put down some money that there were executions going on left and right, before that happened, but like more importantly, it was renamed the Temple of Reason. They were trying to suppress the Catholic Church, which had strongly sided with the, with the anti-revolutionary forces. But like anti-Catholic does not equal atheist. Right, like this is
right, yeah.
And Robespierre was absolutely not an atheist.
My Protestant grandfather is not an atheist.
yeah, exactly, right. Like lots of people in the world are, anti-Catholic but not atheists, and in fact, Robespierre was one of them, right? He was kind of like a weird, Enlightenment deist who, had a, but like he was who sort of tried to start this like state, like kind of at the height of very shortly before his former Confederates turned out to have killed him, because they thought that he'd sort of gone crazy with power, but like he kind of tried to start his own little religion, right? Which was not a non-theistic religion, right? It was the cult of the supreme being, and in fact, if you read like the Hilary Mantel novel, A Place of Greater Safety, she gets into this there, right? He was actually very critical, right, of Jacobins who were atheists, right? In fact, kind of for David Berlinski-ish reasons, right? That it's like, well, you can't take away, belief in God altogether. That's gonna end badly, whatever. So he's just wrong about the history. Seems maybe relevant, but like even if he was right about the history, It's like, okay, like, I mean, surely we're nowhere close to the point where you could like you've examined enough evidence to have an accounting of like, you know, what atheism has to do with this or what the causation is
Yeah.
or any of that stuff.
Yeah, it's just like, the, some historians, as far as I understand it, think that things other than atheism had to do with the French Revolution. I don't know if this is a fringe position or not, but I think there were other factors that led to the French Revolution. But I also wanted to mention just how weird it is to make like a blanket anti-French Revolution statement and like stake out that position like he seems to be doing. But as I mentioned earlier, this is in line with his politics. Like he's not just singling out the excesses of the French Revolution. Like he's, I'm pretty sure, just against the French Revolution, which is a pretty weird position. But I think that, I mean, based on the Ben Shapiro interview that I kind of skipped around through, it seems like that's consistent with his other views. But
Totally.
as I understand his argument so far, since the motion is, does atheism poisons everything? I think he started by arguing that it poisons, our social order, and it poisons like governmental leadership and stuff because there's no higher authority if atheism is true. So they're the highest authority. So it poisons things in that way. And I think now he moved on to it poisons science because you can't really do science without
Right.
theism. So I think he's just saying it poisons,
Eh,
the governmental structure and it poisons the scientific structure.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that is the structure of what he's saying. And yeah, it is like there is also something just a little bit funny about the fact that he's saying, well, look, these totalitarian dictators supposedly were atheists, so therefore they felt empowered to commit all sorts of crimes because there was no one above them to judge them, but like, I mean,
But the
again,
people who were overthrown by the French Revolution, who were definitely not atheists, they don't count against the point I'm making.
yeah, exactly. It's like like this is the entire kind of history of French feudalism, with very closely bound up with the Catholic Church. All of the blood spilled by that regime, the Ancien regime, like that. None of that counts. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure Caligula believed in the gods of Rome. Like that's the evidence that that belief in a higher power prevents people from prevents people who have great amounts of earthly power from abusing it is pretty non-existent. And it's also funny because it's like, I don't know, if you're really concerned about abuses of power, then maybe you should take a second look at that whole French Revolution thing, that they, because I'm pretty sure the actual causes had something to do with unhappiness about power structures and the way they're abused. But
Yeah, and you made an important point too. I
uh,
missed the first time I skipped around this was like, I mean, deism was kind of more of a thing at this point. Like atheism was not really prevalent as far as I understand
no,
it, like until later. It was deism. So I mean, like it's kind of weird to even be associating atheism with the French Revolution to the extent that he's doing.
yeah, I mean, my understanding, I wouldn't claim to be any sort of expert on this. My understanding is that there were people who went all the way to atheism in the French Revolution, of which Robespierre was not one. But that was like a position that was present there. But you're right. I mean, like most people in this era, in most places, who were like religious dissenters, did not go all the way to atheism. And then it would be particularly weird if his argument was going to be not just like atheism poisons everything, but like doubting the authority of the Pope poisons everything or something like that, right? Because again, it does that would seem to fit oddly with his own lack of religiosity.
Yeah, deism poisons everything.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's keep going.
In advance, a hypothesis that not only answers to the human heart in many respects, but that answers to genuine intellectual needs in other respects. When one sees the American scientific community like a herd of wildebeests trotting across a fruited plain, it's very reasonable to ask, are they going someplace or are they fleeing from someplace? And I think the overwhelmingly obvious answer is they are fleeing. They're fleeing from an idea that they reject for a variety of reasons. Not only is the inquiry about atheism not necessary in terms of the history of social thought, it's not necessary in terms of the outlines of scientific thought, but there is a last question to be addressed, perhaps the most important for you and me. The cosmologist Joel Primack asked an interesting question. He asked, what compels the electron to follow the laws of nature? Good question, I don't know. But Heinrich Himmler, who had presided over the destruction of churches and synagogues throughout Europe and was the mastermind behind the extermination of the Jewish people, asked a very similar question in 1944. When confronted with the onerous treaty obligations the German state had adopted with respect to its own satraps, he asked insouciantly, but pregnantly, after all, what compels us to keep our promises? Moral relativism is very often derided as an unhappy consequence of atheism. I don't think moral relativism is a particularly deep issue, but I do think the issue of what compels us to keep our promises is very relevant. I have in front of me rather a remarkable button. If you should press it, yours would be untold riches and whatever else you desire. The only consequence to pressing it beyond your happiness is the death of an anonymous Chinese peasant. Who among us would you trust with this button? Sit still, Christopher. Thank you.
Christopher Hitchens.
I feel like part of being an atheist is tapping a sign once a week that says atheism does not equal nihilism or relativism or Darwinism or social Darwinism. And those things are distinct, by the way, or communism or fascism or determinism or materialism. Like, it's just like, he doesn't really see, he's like, yeah, all these are just kind of the same thing, obviously. So I'm just going to like have this borderline unintelligible mishmash of my, I don't know, personal anxieties about them, and then just like half formulated philosophical questions, and then end on a really weird, lame joke. Like, I'm not even trying to be mean. That was just a weird opening statement.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the problem is that Berlinsky is so like his style of presentation does not lend itself to like clearly identifying what argument he's trying to make. I mean, I think you did a good job earlier in terms of like the structure of his overall presentation, but like at the end there, I mean, the way he said the thing about moral relativism is the big issue is confusing, but given what he said right afterwards, because there are at least two ways you could read that argument about the button that would press that would kill the Chinese peasant. Which, by the way, let's just take a beat to appreciate that being willing to kill Chinese peasants is something that nobody who believes in God has ever been willing, has ever done, right? But
I just remembered that guy, that psycho who went on Tucker Carlson's show and was just like, we need to be sitting on a throne of Chinese skulls. And I guarantee you that guy hates atheism. I guarantee you that guy would totally be on the atheism poisons everything side.
Totally. Yeah. And, I like, look, also, I mean, if you, if you just think about the entire history of the Cold War, right, from armed conflicts, like the Korean War, U.S. and China were on opposite sides, through, the constant threats of mutual total annihilation, through, the, coups against democratically elected governments, through, et cetera, bombing of, bombing of Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. All this is on my mind because I have something in the Nation's coming out tomorrow that talks about Henry Kissinger. But look, what was by far, especially in the early decades of that, like what was by far the most common ideological justification, right? That it was like all justified by the need to, to defeat godless communism.
Hmm.
Like, I mean,
Yeah,
that was how, like 50s, 60s, I mean, that's how they always put it.
I mean, not only that, but I was just thinking as he was saying, I have this button in my hand. It's like, okay, well, I have a button in my hand, and if you press it, it will drop a nuclear bomb on Nagasaki for literally no reason. Like, was that a series of atheists who made that decision? Like, it just, I don't understand this desperate need to like connect atheism with, with mass murder. Like, it just doesn't hold up for like 10 seconds.
No, it doesn't. And it's also okay, so I think there are two ways you could read the Chinese peasant killing button. One is a moral argument, right? That the atheists wouldn't have a moral reason not to do that. And which I think is, maybe more easily dealt with, that because, Euthyphro problem, et cetera, right? But then the other one maybe is that, like, well, the reason that people wouldn't do it is that, they would think that, like, forget morality, they would just think that God would disapprove of it and would therefore punish them, right? So it'd be like fear of hell, maybe, would stop them from doing it. But then, I mean, then that seems to get back to everything we've been saying. That's like, well, at that point, surely that's an empirical question, right? Are people who believe that actually less likely to commit atrocities? And historically, it doesn't really seem like it.
Yeah, I can't really say there's. I mean, he did mention, like, 20th century atrocities, and that seems to be one of his main points in defense of atheism poisoning everything. But I feel like something that's not often brought up in these discussions on either side is, like, there was this exponential growth, this explosion of the human population, which just necessarily means that, like, everything happens on a larger scale.
Right.
But whenever people point to these 20th century atrocities, it's like, do you realize how much there were so many more people? Like, so just everything
yeah.
happened on a bigger scale. And secondly, there were all these technological advancements, like with tanks and missiles and firearms and nuclear weapons and poison gas and fighter planes. It's like, do you think maybe the dramatic increase in, weapons technology and the dramatic increase in population size might have had something to do with, like, the scale of the 20th century atrocities, and not just because, atheism was on the rise within academia?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely, right. Like, yeah, I mean, right, even with the Holocaust, right, that like basically, Fordist industrial, procedure was being applied. I mean, it's not like it's not like the Romans never wiped anybody out, right? Like they have a, but they
Exactly.
couldn't do it nearly as efficiently.
Exactly.
And yeah, so I think that's how, yeah, God, yeah, Vietnam, but then, like, there's also, Steven Pinker is a smug and annoyed reactionary who believes lots of things I don't like, but he's not totally wrong about the, historical claims about violence, right? That it's like people have this idea because they're, it's like a little bit of chronological provincialism, that it's like the stuff that's more recent, like feels more significant, whatever. But it's like people have this idea that there's this like big uptick in like human brutality, in the 20th century. It's like, yeah, in a certain way that I think you just identified, yeah, that there's like some of the worst things that happen, had vastly higher body counts because the technological efficiency, larger populations, etc. But like there are a lot of respects in which the, like the kinds of violence that people were most likely to die of throughout like most of human history have actually gotten not nearly as bad, in the last, the last couple 100 years, right? I mean, that they, like, you know, I mean, there are certain forms of violence that were like way more routine, prior to the modern world. And by the way, I mean, my big beef with Pinker is just that, like, I think his conclusion is bad because, like, his conclusion often seems to be like, well, there's been progress, therefore you should be happy, rather than like there's been progress there, and wouldn't it be nice if we had even more progress? Let's work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in agreement on that point. Like Steven Pinker, who was a visitor of Jeffrey Epstein's private island, is not totally wrong about some of the things he says. Like, yeah, but yeah, the conclusions he draws and the things that he like the things that he attributes the success of modernity to, like at least the aspects that are worth like celebrating. Like, yeah, he does seem to not. I mean, I just disagree with him on the cause, I guess, but it's not like I disagree with the data or anything. Where it's like, yeah, there are certain types of violence that you're less likely to experience in the modern world than you were, thousands of years ago. Like, yeah, that's definitely true. But as a nice counterpoint to Pinker, though, Rutger Bregman did write this book called Humankind that was really good and worth checking out for people who want to see, sort of a nice contrast to the Pinker thesis.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess last point before we move on from this, a point that, like, a point that I don't think Hitchens is going to make here, from what I can recall, and I don't think he does in general, but I always really want him to, because it's like such a simple point. I actually did make this the one chance I've ever had to do a debate with somebody who Hitchens had is with Douglas Wilson, and I did make this with Douglas Wilson, which is like, look, if you want to say that like atheism breeds, like personal immorality, like, I mean, some of these Scandinavian countries have the highest rates of religious non-belief in the Western world, and also much, much lower rates of violent crime. Now, because I'm not a hack, I'm not going to claim that like atheism, caused that, right? Like that would be silly, right? But it does at least suggest that atheism, or at least atheism in connection with more egalitarian economic policies, is consistent with not having a mass outbreak of everybody deciding that because God is dead, everything is permitted, and they should just like do whatever they want to whoever they want whenever.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just like it does prove, though, that religion is not this like social glue that is necessary for a functioning society.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's not to say atheism caused their success. Like, no, obviously it didn't. But it does prove that religion is not this necessary component of any functioning society. But this is when the Tom Holland types or Jordan Peterson types say, well, they're actually Christian, or they're just kind of like riding off the high of Christianity, and like, it's only a matter of time before it, collapses, I guess, because, you need it to function. But, that kind of stuff.
But that's always amazing when people like trot that out, because it's like, okay, well, hold up, right? So like, like people being guillotined in the 1790s by people who, by executioners who are by and large not even atheists, whatever. But like that's that could be attributable to de-Christianization, but like hundreds of years later, if everybody's still acting decently, that's because like the de-Christianization hasn't had enough time to kick in.
I just want to point out that someone in the chat said, everyone knows gingers don't have souls, and I demand that this hate speech be removed from the chat immediately, or else I will be leaving.
Fair enough. All right. Let's keep going.
Thank you, Professor Berlinsky. Thank you, Larry, for the very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. At short notice, I can only hope to match the Parisian urbanity of my rival in knowledge of French ecclesiastical architecture and its cosmic implications, and in the ready access to modern 20th century poetry. Well, let's take, instead of Notre Dame and the famous story of its deconsecration by Danton and Robespierre, the erection of the other most prominent église of Paris, the one that you see on your way in from the airport, the grand wedding cake style erection of Sacré-Cœur, the Sacred Heart, built on top of the commanding heights of Montmartre. Built why? Built to celebrate the massacre of Parisian workers and intellectuals after the Paris Commune of 1871 had tried to save the honor of a humiliated France that had thrown itself officially and was thrashing at the feet of Bismarck as Prussian invaders. Many, many more people were killed in that massacre, in that terrible reprisal, than were killed in the whole of the terror. But it wasn't enough that was the case, but a whole church had to be consecrated by the French religious and clerical establishment and their political allies to celebrate the massacre of their fellow countrymen. Does this prove that religion poisons everything? By no means does it do so. Does it help to curtain raise and to understand the terrible century which Professor Berlinsky and I have both studied? Yes, to a degree it does. This French right wing, clerical right wing, goes on to the terrible arraignment and frame up of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, possibly the most serious miscarriage of justice in most thoroughgoingly justified and advanced by a political establishment in modern European history. This and the sides taken in it determine who will be who in the terrible War of 1914, which Dermot McCullough, admired by Larry Taunton among others as a historian of Christianity and very much venerated by me in his magnificent history, new history of the first 2,000 years of Christianity, describes as a theocratic war. He says the Christendom, as we used to understand it, as our fathers and grandfathers used to understand it, ends in 1914 when every country in Europe goes to war in the name of its own God or church. King George VI is the king emperor and the head of the Church of England. The Tsar of Russia is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is considered not to be a god, but a little more than a human being. You know the rest of it. It's the first time that Gott mit uns is put on the belt buckles, but not the last time, of the German army. And this is the end of Christendom and the curtain raiser to fascism. Without that terrible war of Christendom, it's impossible that the totalitarian movements that became such a threat to civilization could have arisen in the first place. And just to stay with France, it is the Vichy collaborationist regime, the rounder up of France's Jews, the massacre agent in the French colonies, the collaborator with the Third Reich, that strikes from the French coinage the noble words liberty, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and replaces them with the Catholic slogan, famille, patrie, travail. And under this, France fell to the lowest point of its history. So I would beware, sir, of deriving your argument about atheism from the coincidences of French ecclesiastical design. But I'm with you on the larger point that you made, and I'll also try and illustrate it from the work actually of a great Anglo-Catholic, Anglo-American poet, Thomas Stearns Eliot, who in his choruses from the Rock asks the question, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? This is a question that has to preoccupy us all. When I am told, and I suppose in one way you could accuse me of taking it on faith, because I couldn't prove it for myself, and having had it demonstrated to me, I probably couldn't repeat the demonstration. But having been told by Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss and all of the leaders in the field of physics that we now estimate a total of 400 billion galaxies. That's not universes or solar systems, 400 billion galaxies. And asked to decide the question, with one sun every second since the Big Bang, or one star. We only call our own star the sun in an apotropaic, propitiating way that comes from our terrorized ancestors. A star that size goes out every second. So that's quite a lot while I'm talking. And has been blowing up and going out ever since the first moment of the Big Bang. This is more than we can handle. We cannot say we know about this. It can be argued that all that was indeed set in motion with the intention of producing, on a very small planet, in a very small solar system, in a tiny neglected suburb of a relatively unimportant galaxy, a race of beings, primate, but capable of language and reason, who believe that if they make the right propitiations, they will live forever. You could say that all that gigantic explosion and destruction was designed with that in mind, but I wouldn't be able to take your word for it. And it seems to me that the burden is not on me. I don't have to prove that kind of thing. I don't make the equivalent claim that the religious person has to make. The religious person doesn't have to just say, of course God wanted it that way and that's the way it is. Because a design of that kind doesn't just imply a designer, it implicates a designer. It means if there is such a designer, he's fantastically destructive and wasteful, as he is in microcosm. 99.8% of all species ever on this earth have already become extinct. This is a pitiless, wasteful, capricious designer. I can't prove that that isn't the way he wanted it to be, but I can say that there's an implication for the designer. But again, it's not me who's saying that if you believe in it, you have the means of grace and the hope of glory and the possibility of redemption and vicarious salvation and forgiveness of sins through human sacrifice and eternal life. We can't attempt and don't try anything like that. So the agnostic or the deist is not arbitrating between equal kinds of certainty. Those who are certain in the face of all this uncertainty and unknowability, the strongest ground of agreement between me and David, are bound to say, if they're arbitrating it properly, the first people to leave the island are the ones who say they already know enough, that they know why this is happening, that they know the mind of God. Those who claim the certainty are out of the argument. The argument then goes on between deists, agnostics, and atheists. How can we make sense of what we know? And how can we, in doing so, be true to the great principle adumbrated by Socrates, which is this: you must educate yourself by striving constantly, excuse me, as hard as you can to get to the point of understanding your own ignorance. Only then can you claim to have any acquaintance with knowledge at all. That's the appropriate and due modesty that the founder of our school of thought brought to the question. And there's no proof that Socrates ever existed. I tend to think from the eyewitness accounts and secondhand ones that he did. It would be quite hard to confect such a personality, but it doesn't matter to me whether he existed or not. We have the method. He taught us how to think. If I was to tell Larry after our drive down through Shenandoah yesterday and our joint reading of the first passages of the Gospel of St. John, that the Jesus who is so real to him is in fact, or could be proved to be, only a fictitious person, a mythical individual, it would have to ruin Comrade Taunton's day. Not just his day, his life. It would extinguish his hope. Is there not something slightly fanatical in placing such large claims? Remember the size of the claims I'm talking about.
3 minutes.
On such a slender and narrow basis. Now we'll get to the Nazis in my rebuttal, if that's all right. That won't take frightfully long, and to the totalitarians. And we'll have to do, can we be moral without believing fantastic things? That won't take too long either. And we can do a number of other things too that I have so far left unaddressed, but believe me, not forgotten. But I just wanted to see if I could introduce just for once a new element into this argument. You must, when you next go to Washington, go to the newest museum in the United States. It's the newly opened Hall of Human Origins in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. It's, by the way, paid for by Mr. Koch, the former Libertarian candidate for president and founder and paymaster of the Tea Party movement. So I invite you to join me once again in saying, in some way, this really is a great country. Here is the greatest gallery giving the proper account of evolution and our true origins that has ever been erected in any country. The bit that has fascinated me and taken me back to it again and again is this. Until 17,000 years ago, only in one case, and not many more years than that in others, there were at least 3 other hominid or human species primates like us with large brain pans, language capacity, in the case of the Neanderthals, very significantly, decorated graves, which suggests, if it doesn't insist upon the idea of a ritual and a religion. They have genes in common with us. They are of our species. And they've left important traces. They weren't very well understood, or in some cases known at all. The case of the Flores Islanders of the Indonesian archipelago only until very recently. But there they always were. They were our brothers and our sisters and our kin, and they had all these yearnings and hopes and terrors and fears. And they're not in Genesis. And they've had no one to visit their graves or do them honor until very recently, and as a result of scientific innovation and curiosity. And whatever gods they had abandoned them. And so I just think it's worth brooding, since we talk about ourselves as the objects of a tremendous cosmic and biological process that was set in motion, supervised, and if it's to be believed, designed, intended. I just think we should take a moment of silence and think of our fellow humans, our fellow creatures, our fellow extinct, already extinct members of our species, to whom we might spare a little thought before we go on. I'm in your debt, and I'll be back. Thanks.
French architecture and its cosmic implications. Oh, hey, are you there? I think you're muted.
Yep, had a computer issue for a second, but yeah. So, by the way, I'm not quite sure what point he was making at the with the thing about Charles Koch at the end. I will say that as terrible as Hitchens' politics were at this point in his life, it's no, Lucy's standing there. You know, he did have quite a bit of contempt for the Tea Party. So, you know, I don't think he thought that was a good thing. I think maybe he thought it was kind of funny. Right?
I think he was saying, in summary, America is a land of contrasts.
Yeah, exactly.
He's saying this evil dude, you know, created one of the best, you know, exhibits on evolution by natural selection in existence. You know.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, so I think that's the point. I mean, this is, yeah, I mean, even very late Hitchens, when he obviously has some, you know, I think fairly repugnant neoconservative kind of foreign policy positions. He's still doing things like writing, I think in Slate, about the rally that Glenn Beck organized in Washington D.C. in 2009, where he refers to it as the water world of white self-pity, and you know he's not a you know, he's not a fan, but yeah, I think that this is you know, I think this is fine. I mean, it's like a little bit. I think it was a little bit unstructured. Some of that might be a result of, you know, I mean, he's kind of trying to mirror and respond to all the stuff that Berlinsky had said, but you know, he also wants it to be a real opening statement and not just the sort of you know, pedantic thing I might feel tempted to do, where you just kind of go through it point by point. I think the strongest part to my mind, which is actually impressive, because I mean, I assume it was impromptu, that, you know, that he didn't have any particular reason to think that Berlinsky was going to bring up French history. But yeah, I think the couple minutes on French history at the beginning, you know, was probably the strongest part, and also, you know, the part that felt most like he was kind of channeling sort of young socialist Hitchens.
Yeah, I mean, near the end, I think he touched on like a really powerful argument. He didn't spell it out too much, but he sort of talked about evolutionary history, and he mentioned, you know, the incredible waste, but he also mentioned like the capriciousness and the like, you know, brutality of that process. And I wish he would have, you know, pulled on that thread a little more. But yeah, the idea that this omnipotent, benevolent God is going to bring about his very good creation through the process of evolution by natural selection is like fairly absurd when you contemplate the hundreds of millions of years of predation and carnivory and parasitism and languishing and just suffering and pain that's taken place. And God obviously didn't have to do it that way, but he was also talking about the scale of the universe, and if you could actually comprehend how large it was, it just is like kind of crazy to think that we're any kind of focal point. It just starts getting more and more laughable. But yeah, I like the argument from evolutionary evil, which is something that he touched on.
I should say, the argument from evolution. My understanding is that the reason that Charles Darwin became an agnostic by the end of his life, when I think he was actually like a seminarian or had been considering becoming one at one point earlier, but the way in which his biological investigation turned him into an agnostic wasn't like, oh, this conflicts with a literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, because I'm sure any respectable, mid to late 19th century, Anglican, could handle that, right? It was the argument from evolutionary evil, right? It's like just sort of contemplating just the absolutely absurd waste of like all of the generations and generations and generations of creatures, dying out, as and suffering, as part of this excruciatingly slow evolutionary process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a soul-crushing amount of evil, but it's also just, I mean, what Darwin keyed in on as well was the design of evil, like evil being built into the design plan of nature, like where he was disturbed by these parasitic wasps that laid eggs in caterpillars and kept them alive, as they ate their way out of the caterpillar. And he wrote, that specifically was part of why he like couldn't believe in God. He's like, how could God, create beings where just in virtue of their natural function, their faculties are aimed at producing suffering for other sentient creatures? Like, right. That's not designed by a benevolent designer, obviously.
Yeah, I remember. So my graduate school professor Quentin Smith, who's now passed on, but he had I remember reading a long time ago a paper that he wrote making that exact point. That you could run the entire problem of evil just with just on the basis of natural laws that impel some animals to kill others in really painful ways. And I think he kind of says at the beginning of that he got the idea for the paper because he was like staying in a cabin or something out in the middle of the woods, like maybe while he was working on a book or something, and he was like listening to some animal kill some other animal out of the woods, and like this kind of I mean, obviously it's not original. The point, the underlying thought is not original to him, but that's but like it really hit him that like this is a sort of underemphasized, part of the problem of evil.
Yeah, that was the paper that was called "The Argument from Evil Natural Laws," I believe.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's a great paper and a great argument. It's like there's something similar from Felipe Leon called "The Argument from Teleological Evil." Quentin Smith's article is a lot more technical. It's a lot less like accessible for a lay audience. But no, Quentin Smith was a genius, and he's very sorely missed. But yeah, that's an amazing argument where he just says like, yeah, it's a law of nature that animals have to savagely kill and devour each other. But it didn't have to be that way. They could be herbivores, they could be, scavengers, they could photosynthesize or something. We're talking about like an omnipotent God. So the idea that that's the law of nature, that you have to savagely devour and eat other creatures, like it's a horrible way to live. And like there's no way that a benevolent designer would set up a system like that when there are obviously other options, especially when it's mostly suffering inflicted on animals. It's not like these are moral agents who can grow and learn from the trials of their lives.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is enough of a problem even with humans that, that like, if you have an earthquake or something and, a bunch of people die right away, and a bunch of other people, are like trapped under the rubble for a few days this slowly, die of thirst. It's like, well, maybe a few of them will get out and maybe for the sake of argument, they'll have some growth and evolution, based on that. But like the ones who died certainly won't, right?
Yeah,
And then it's
the 8-year-olds trapped under the rubble as they're dying of dehydration. They're going to gain some really virtuous traits before they
the
die.
last 5 minutes of their existence. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, how much more of a problem is it with the animals who have the capacity to suffer, but presumably not really the level of cognitive capacity that you have to like reflect on your experience and grow from it.
Mm-hmm. And then when
Yeah.
you contemplate, this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah.
It's an incredible amount of evidence that's contrary to the idea that there's this unsurpassably great being of perfect love and benevolence who designed ultimately the natural order. But yeah, I really like
Yeah.
that argument. I'm glad Hitchens mentioned it at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also say that okay. Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything Hitchens says in that opening statement. I will say, just for the sake of calling balls and strikes, honestly, that as much as it sort of sounds good as he's saying it, I'm not honestly sure what it means to say that this is a suburb of a not particularly important, galaxy. It's like I don't know what makes some galaxies more important than others.
Yeah, no, he's definitely gifted in rhetoric. I mean, this just a hot take on my part. Hitchens is a brilliant public speaker, but yeah, I mean, sometimes the substance can get kind of lost in it. But I do really just enjoy listening to him. Like it's been a while since I've listened to anything with him. But yeah, he's someone in the chat was saying, oh, it seems like he's depleted a little bit. It's like, well, he does appear to be undergoing chemotherapy, but he's still bringing it, in my mind, at least. He seems like he's, it looks like we have more technical difficulties here. I'm alone on stream. Well, it's just
Sorry,
you and me, guys.
Yeah, I just have to not touch this computer, I guess, for the rest of the night. But as people can no doubt tell with their keen powers of observation, I'm not where I normally am when I do this stuff. So there's no bookcase behind me and whatever. So I've kind of got the laptop propped up in a place where I really shouldn't touch it too much, or else that's going to happen again.
I was panicking for a minute because you were gone there, but no,
Yeah.
I was just about to start talking about utilitarianism or something because Matthew Adelstein jumped in the chat. You put him on screen because you just had like 2 debates with him about utilitarianism, and I just had not a debate with him, but we talked for like 3 hours on my channel about it yesterday. And he very generously said that he spoke to both of us about utilitarianism rather than saying he owned us with facts and logic and proved utilitarianism, which is how he feels about it.
Yeah, it's definitely how he feels about it. But whatever. I'm very, I'm obviously not convinced, but I also think, I also think the man can, like make a really elaborate case, and I'm not be real hesitant about this because I think it could sound like not like I mean it, right? I mean this in an absolutely sincere way, but like I'm also like blown away. It's like I'm not totally clear on how old he is, but like I'm pretty sure I was a complete dumbass at the same age.
Yeah. No, I was I think he's 18 because I know he's about to be a freshman in college. But yeah, I was I had no interest in philosophical questions. I was just like playing guitar and like trying to get laid until I was 19. I didn't have any kind of interesting philosophical thought go through my head until I was like 18. And he's already like, he seemingly knows everything there is to know about utilitarianism and has like firm convictions about it.
Yeah, no, that's crazy. Okay, let's get back to it. Share screen. Let's do it.
We now move to rebuttals. 6 minutes, Dr. Berlinsky.
Thank you very much. There's a disturbing area of agreement I sense between Mr. Hitchens and myself, which I will do my best to minimize. Please remember, ladies and gentlemen, that when it comes to the wickedness of religion, I have ceded the point. It's no longer argumentative. I would remind you, however, of a remark Dr. Johnson made. He made it about original sin, and I paraphrased him. He said, "The inquiry is not necessary, for all the laws of heaven and earth are unable to prevent men from their crimes." Now, Mr. Hitchens is very much in the position of someone watching a cripple walking painfully with 2 crutches, moving arduously, and saying to himself and saying to you, "I've got a great idea, kick one of the crutches away. Everything will be so much better." That seems to me a weak argument. A weak argument, not an impossible argument. I would welcome the defense of the argument. But it is no rebuttal to my position that atheism poisons everything, that religion poisons something. There are plenty of poisons in the world. We don't lack an abundance. Second point I would like to mention is this strange the views of, say, Lawrence Krauss or Stephen Hawking. You know, Stephen Hawking just published a book, and I don't know whether any of you have yet seen it. It is, again, a book explaining how everything began, why it's there, why we shouldn't worry about God, and a multitude of other subjects. He published it in collaboration with a friend of mine, Leonard Molodino, and of course, the lines are very deep in the bookstores. And to paraphrase the claim that he now makes, having given up A through N, he now champions something called M theory. The claim that he now makes is the universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory. The universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory. I don't deny what Stephen Hawking has said. I do not endorse it. I haven't read the book, although I've read his other books. I respect Hawking as a reputable physicist who did his great work 30 or 40 years ago. But I can tell you this, what is lamentably lacking in every one of these discussions is that coruscating spirit of skepticism, which a Christopher Hitchens or a Richard Dawkins or a Vic Stengel will bring to religious claims, and that lapses absurdly when it comes to scientific claims. Surely we should have the sophistication to wonder at any asseveration of the form that the universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory, a theory that no one can understand, whose mathematical formalism hasn't been completed, and which has never once been tested in any laboratory on the face of the earth. Third and final point of rebuttal, the fact that the earth, our home, is a small part of the physical universe does not mean it is not the center of the universe. That is a non sequitur. After all, no one would argue, least of all Mr. Hitchens, that the doctrine that home is where the heart lies is rendered false by distance. We should be very careful about making these claims. I agree, the universe is very big, lots of galaxies, amazing things. And there is certainly some point of continuity between human beings and the animals that went before. But as for the central religious claim that this particular place is blessed and important, that's quite different. No doctrine about physical size rebuts it. Thanks very much.
So there's not that much to talk about here, but I do, maybe before I turn it over to whatever you have, I just want to say, I think that Berlinsky is kind of trying to have it both ways here, because this is his claim, right? Atheism poisons everything. So what do you mean by that? And in the opening, right, the first thing he said almost, right, like I think maybe after the stuff about how the French Revolution was bad, is, religion may poison some things, but, atheism poisons everything, which certainly sounds like a claim that, again, I don't think it's helpful to have this discussion sort of at the same time as the what's actually true discussion. You can keep those separate, but it certainly sounds like his claim is that the consequences of not believing in God are worse than the consequences of believing in God. And if that, otherwise, I'm not sure how to interpret, religion poisons some things, atheism poisons everything. So it seems like if that's going to be his claim, then when Hitchens brings up all of this stuff about the, bad consequences of religion, I mean, that is actually going to be relevant to undermining that claim. And you can't just say, well, hey, I already said that there was some bad stuff about religion. It's like that seems like a little bit trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, no, he's like, I already said that religion poisons some things, but it's like, okay, well, I think someone in Hitchens' position could grant, well, I will concede that atheism poisons some things for some people some of the time. I mean, does that invalidate everything that you've said, David? Like, I don't think it does. Like, you should just, I don't know. Yeah, it does seem like he's being kind of slippery about it. Like, he doesn't want to really like buck up and defend the kind of radical position that he's staking out here, like atheism poisons everything. But yeah, I mean, honestly, the thing that annoyed me the most about that whole rebuttal was just the Stephen Hawking aside. I don't know, just keying in on Stephen Hawking like he's the Pope of atheism, like whatever he says about why the universe exists is like the best answer that there is or something. And yeah, it's in line with his opening statement. He doesn't address practically anything that atheists have said about this. Like, he just kind of references this one guy who's a physicist who openly hates philosophy. So of course is not going to have like a really great answer to like an abstract philosophical question like that. But if you don't mind, I did want to like take a minute to address. So
Yep.
I think that the whole why is there something rather than nothing question, or, why does the universe exist question, I think the best response to that is something that has come from Graham Oppy, who's a well-respected philosopher of religion. So however theists explain the existence of God, then atheists can explain the existence of nature in the same way. So if it's open to theists to say that God exists of necessity, then it's open to naturalists or atheists to say that the universe or some region of the natural order exists of necessity. If it's open to theists to say that God is a brute fact, he just is and that's all, then it's open to atheists to say the same thing about the universe or nature or what have you. So the best response to why is there something rather than nothing is not like an assertion of your preferred answer, because I have a preferred answer, you have a preferred answer probably, but it's like a deep question, and I don't know what the right answer is to like why does the universe exist. But this is just sort of like a general strategy for approaching the question in the theism versus atheism debate. So don't just try to defend your own particular answer. Don't ask rhetorically who created God, or say that God did it is always a bad explanation, or just say they're doing a God of the gaps argument. Like, the best strategy is pointing out that whatever range of options is open to a theist and explaining why God exists. If you ask a theist that question, they're going to have some kind of response to you. Okay, whatever range of options is open to them in answering why God exists, the same exact range of options is going to be open to the atheist in explaining the existence of nature. So if we're trying to explain why there's something rather than nothing, or why the universe exists, just postulating a God doesn't provide any explanatory advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair, that's I would say that's what the question, who created God, is gesturing at, right? Is that exact point, right? That that like you haven't actually, like, you're not done yet, right? If you say everything else exists because God exists, it's like, well, look, if you accept for the sake of argument that it's this like, it's like this deep problem, right? Like, why is there something rather than nothing? Then surely that applies to God too. I mean, at least that's how I would.
Yeah. No, there's a good point. Like, when you ask that rhetorical question, like, there's a good point lurking in there. It's just, in my opinion, not the best expression of the point. And there's also just a pragmatic consideration, which is that this is just like a meme in philosophy of religion. And if you say who created God, you will, like, every theist will immediately start having a meltdown, and they will not listen to anything you say after that. So just pragmatically, it's worth just not saying. Like,
Yeah,
just
I guess
find another way to make the same point.
I guess I do find it a little frustrating that when you get advocates of positions who sort of turn really good objections to their position into memes. So it's like, I think I would kind of say the same thing about the what about the roads objection
Yeah.
to like extreme libertarianism. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, that's actually a good question about your position, right? Like you should have an answer to that.
Yeah, I remember that clip from the Libertarian Convention, the one where with the driver's license thing. But I remember some earlier part of that where that that guy who was like hell no to
Yeah.
the toaster thing or whatever. He also said like, oh yeah, what about the roads? And then everyone in the audience laughed, and I'm just like, what about the roads? Like
No,
that's a
but
good
seriously, what
objection
about
to
the
your
roads? How's that
position.
going to work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like that would just be like, you know, it's like if I were just going to be like every time somebody brought up like the socialist, calculation debate, that like as like a problem, right? For full socialist plan, I was just like, oh, ha, ha, calculation. It's like, no, I mean that's a real problem, right? You got to have a, you got to have a response to that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's um,
It's
well,
it's
and I
still
mean,
tactically more useful, I think, and like more philosophically, I think,
yeah,
defensible. To if someone says, well, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? Then just
yeah,
turning the question on them and saying, well, why does God exist? And saying, look, I don't even know how you're going to answer, but however you could answer as a theist, that same range of options is open to me as an atheist for explaining the existence of
right.
nature.
It's a
So
way of
postulating a God just doesn't help anything.
helpfully spelling out why it's a good question, I guess.
Yeah.
I, I mean, yeah, I mean, with the Stephen Hawking thing, I think because Hitchens said something about Hawking earlier. Now I don't remember exactly what he said, but they have um, but so I think that's why he was bringing it up. Well, well, he sucks too kind of thing. But then in uh, hold on just a second. There we go. So, but like his objection to Hawking, I mean, okay, so I just did my defense of why, I mean, I guess we agreed, right, on how to put this, right? There's a good objection lurking, there's a good point lurking in the who made God question, right? I mean, I guess this would be my defense of the, God did is not a good explanation, line that like, when he's dismissing Hawking, right? So he's like, okay, like I think, right? And look, I'm not a Stephen Hawking fan. I share a lot of your frustration that he's too dismissive of philosophy, etc. Right? But it's like, but I think the context here is that Hawking is saying, well, if you correctly understand whatever model of physics, then according to him, you don't need to postulate a creator and like whatever. I think that's probably not a very good argument anyway, right? I suspect once we like really look into what he means by it, right? Because I mean, again, it's like because like physicists who sort of make big inferences from like whatever they're studying, from the empirical premises about physics to these like huge philosophical controversies. I think oftentimes, have not really spent very much time thinking about the underlying controversy, and it shows, right? So it's like the point of this is not to particularly defend Hawking, but like I think Berlinski's response to Hawking is a really bad response because he's saying, well, look, Hawking has this sort of mathematical formalism for his physical theory that's like very elegant or whatever, but we shouldn't take it seriously because it hasn't really been empirically tested. And the problem, and I mean, I think in some ways it goes back to the same point that Graham Opie is making and what you just quoted is like, okay, but like, let's apply a single standard here, right? Like if you're saying, well, Stephen Hawking has this like very complex, well worked out theory, but it's really hard to test. Therefore, we should just dismiss that as an explanation. Then what are the tests that you're claiming that that like God created everything and that has passed, right? I mean, like as how are you saying that like that should be considered a serious explanation, but like what Hawking is saying shouldn't?
Yeah. No, there's just so many weird gaps in Berlinski's case here. But yeah, it's like it just feels, I'm just annoyed that he's going after a physicist at all in this,
Yeah.
because it's like, of course a physicist is going, especially kind of like an anti-philosophy one, is going to have kind of a bad answer to this. But I guess Berlinski's case is like, well, atheism poisons, among other things, scientific inquiry, and it leads you to say silly things like Stephen Hawking said, when he's trying to explain why anything exists. And the thing is, like, that's not the fault of atheism. That's the fault of Stephen Hawking not knowing anything about philosophy and refusing to learn about it. Like most physicists, like who are in the public eye,
Right.
this is a very abstract philosophical question. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's not even clear that it's a meaningful question, but trying to solve it with, quantitative, like physical models just seems like the wrong kind of approach. And, it's just physicists are the wrong people to ask this question.
I strongly agree with all of the above, but I will also say that I think Berlinski's objection might be the worst objection that you could really make, which is not like, because like the right objection would have been along the lines of what you just said. Hey, even if Hawking is completely right about how all this works, it doesn't really get to the why is there something rather than nothing question, right? Maybe
Right,
it just
yeah.
like pushes it back or something. That's like a perfectly reasonable response, which, without knowing all the details, I would still put down a fair amount of money on the prediction that like if we like spent a long time looking at the details, that's exactly what we conclude, right? That it's like this is because I agree, it's the wrong kind of way to go about trying to respond to this question. But then Berlinski's response is, well, you shouldn't believe Hawking and Penrose on the actual physical theory because because it's because it they're because it hasn't been tested or something like that, right? It's like, well, in that case, like what's the test you think
Yeah.
that the religious explanation has undergone that hasn't?
Yeah. If that's the standard here. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, let's keep going.
I swore to answer Professor Berlinski's 2 points about totalitarianism and atheism. Well, his 1 point, and I had one to make, perhaps I'll make it in preface. Atheism by itself is, of course, not a moral position or a political one of any kind. It simply is the refusal to believe in a supernatural dimension or a supernatural supervisor or dictator. And it's maintenance of the view that though that cannot be disproved, no good evidence has ever been adduced for it or any good argument put forward for it. But that's where it ends. You can be an atheist and a nihilist. You can be an atheist and a sadist. You can be an atheist and say, as is said in Dostoevsky's famous passage of Brothers Karamazov, without God, anything is possible, anything is doable, is thinkable. Of course, that's open, I would say, immediately to the objection that anyone who says they have God on their side also awards themselves, and you can see it happening by opening the newspaper, the right to commit any crime, however ghastly. That there's no escape from the existence of certain psychopathic human beings who either for want of supervision or by invoking the idea that they are the agents of a divine supervisor will do anything at all. But that gets us no further forward. You can be an atheist and a fascist. Most fascists were actually Christian. You can be an atheist and a communist. Most, but not all communists, were unbelievers by definition. You can be an atheist and perfectly indifferent to your fellow creatures. But there is a humanism within atheism. It starts, I think, with Lucretius, who put the atomic theory of Democritus and Epicurus into a wonderful poem that effectively suggested not that people were using religion as a crutch, as you so in such a domesticated and furry way put it, but that instead on a very hot day, they were putting on a huge, heavy overcoat and dragging a ball and chain. Oh,
That just reminded me that I completely forgot to say anything about this earlier, but that crutch metaphor earlier was pretty amazing because the only way I could understand what he's saying is exactly the super cynical elitist view that we were talking about earlier, right? That's like, well, look, you, Christopher Hitchens, you can get by without religion, but all of these poor stupid plebes, they clearly need it.
Oh, I hadn't even connected that, but yeah, I also just thought it
Or
was
if
so
that's not
funny.
what he's saying, I don't know what he's saying.
It's also such a great tactic to begin your rebuttal by just saying, like, now imagine someone were to kick the crutch out of a disabled person. If you like that idea, then go ahead and agree with my opponent. If you think that's bad, then maybe you want to come over to my side. That's just so awesome.
Yeah, that is kind of right up there with Lois Griffin at the mayoral debate, answering every question with 9/11.
If you would like to disrespect 9/11 and its victims, then
Exactly.
maybe you'd be more comfortable on Hitchens' side.
But that instead, on a very hot day, they were putting on a huge, heavy overcoat and dragging a ball and chain. Oh dear, my crops have failed. I didn't make enough sacrifices. Oh God, I've had a filthy thought. Now I'm going to hell. Or my children are, because I didn't baptize them. Man-forged manacles of terror and ignorance and stupidity, the emancipation of which, of our species, has been millimetrically slow, but in which materialist and atheist thinkers have played a great part. Without Lucretius, you only have to read Galileo's work. He's inspired by the work of Lucretius. Considers himself to be very lucky to possess one of the very few copies of Lucretius's work that was not destroyed in the Christian centuries, in the hope of putting an end to such terrible, unwise speculations as that, as so much of Galileo's work was either destroyed or censored. On the thread is passed on. It's picked up by the greatest Jew who ever breathed, Baruch Spinoza, changing his name later after his excommunication from the synagogue to Benedict, who said, if there's a God, he's pantheistic, he's in nature, there's no personal God, prayers are not answered, divine interventions do not occur. The consolations of philosophy must be resorted to. From him and people like him, we get the Enlightenment, in which not only Danton and Robespierre, ladies and gentlemen, have their share, but Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and the founders of this great republic and the Philadelphia Enlightenment. This is not a tradition of which anyone on my side need be ashamed. And of course, not all of it is atheist, some of it is deist, but it becomes more atheist as Darwin and Einstein and others approach us with their mind-boggling, almost one wants to say mind-altering findings. And you perhaps will say it's a coincidence that Einstein is expelled by the Third Reich, along with anyone else who understood anything about biology or physics, as practitioners of Jewish science. I'm sorry, the area of agreement has just contracted, sir. For you to say of Nazism that it was the implementation of the work of Charles Darwin is a filthy slander, undeserving of you, and an insult to this audience. Darwin's thought was not taught in Germany. Darwinism was derided in Germany, along with every other form of unbelief. All the great modern atheist thinkers, Darwin, Einstein, and Freud, were alike despised by the National Socialist regime. And there is, it said, I believe it to be true, a misprint in one German edition of The Origin of Species, from which the full statement that evolution requires the survival of the fittest is taken, a statement never made by Darwin, who, as anyone knows, says that adaptability is what is likeliest to give survival or luck or advantage, we'd better say, in the struggle. Now, just to take the most notorious of the 20th century totalitarianisms, the most finished example, the most perfected one, the most ruthless and refined one, that of National Socialism, the one that fortunately allowed the escape of all these great atheist thinkers and many others to the United States, country of separation of church and state that gave them welcome. If it's an atheistic regime, then how come that in the first chapter of Mein Kampf, Hitler says he's doing God's work and executing God's will in destroying the Jewish people? How come the Führer oath that every officer of the party and the army had to take, making Hitler into a minor god, begins, I swear in the name of Almighty God, my loyalty to the Führer? How come that on the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier it says Gott mit uns, God on our side? How come that the first treaty made by the National Socialist dictatorship, the very first, is with the Vatican, exchanging political control of Germany for Catholic control of German education? How come that the churches celebrated the birthday of the Führer every day, every year, I mean, on that day, until democracy put an end to this filthy, quasi-religious, superstitious, barbarous, reactionary system. Again, this is not a difference of emphasis between us to suggest that there's something fascistic about me and my beliefs is something I won't hear said and you shouldn't believe. Thank you.
Dr. Berlinsky, your recount, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I've endeavored to assert the following problem.
You know, I think just like some historians have claimed that factors other than atheism were present in the French Revolution, I think some have also claimed that anti-Semitism had something to do with the rise of Nazism, and it's just so bizarre. It's like it's not even like you have to be some kind of atheist partisan to reject the kind of pseudo history that Berlinsky is kind of slipping in there. I mean, sometimes it's subtle enough, or maybe he's just so boring that I can't focus. But like he is slipping in some fairly pernicious things, like about like just some bizarre misreadings of history. Yeah, but I mean, if you want to talk about like, because I mean, Hitchens was starting to talk about you know, the sort of the Christian or at least theistic overtones of you know the Nazi regime, or you know, a little bit about anti-Semitism. It's like, you know, I mean, I think Christianity has a lot to do with anti-Semitism. Like, I mean, anti-Semitism's been around for a long time, obviously, and within the Christian tradition, the Jews are regarded as Christ killers. Like they literally murdered God, and the Catholic Church didn't admit until
well after the World War II,
yeah, after World War II, like I think decades after, that the Jews were not collectively guilty of the murder of God. And you know, Martin Luther, I just remembered this from his opening statement, from Berlinsky's opening statement, where he was saying how the Nazis like killed disabled people, and they were like, oh, well, we're doing this because of natural selection or something. And it's like, well, first of all, you know, Darwinism doesn't equal social Darwinism. It's just very strange misreading on their part to think that they need to kill disabled people because of Darwinism. That's just, I mean, like, I don't understand how you could hold atheism responsible for that. You couldn't even hold Darwinism responsible for that. But Martin Luther advocated killing disabled people, I believe. I mean, I know he thought that they didn't have souls, like people who were cognitively disabled. And speaking of Martin Luther, he also wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which advocated, you know, brutal violence against them. But I mean, if you just want to start pinning anti-Semitism on atheism, like, I don't know if Berlinsky directly did that. Again, he's like being kind of slippery. He's not saying anything very directly, but it's just very annoying to me. Of just like all these bad things are, we can pin it on this thing I don't like, atheism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea that anti-Semitism, you know, being as big a deal as, you know, like that, like, you know, sure, you know, you have all sorts of, you know, prejudices, or, you know, or, you know, tensions between, you know, between different groups that, you know, that could have, you know, arisen regardless. But I mean, the sort of scale and intensity of anti-Semitism in Europe, you know, in the 20th century is explicable at all, right? You know, without the history of Christianity is just kind of bizarre in its face. I mean, this is actually probably the thing that, you know, you could most obviously, you know, connect to that. But yeah, I mean, this, like, again, it's, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how Berlinsky responds to this, because I think that, you know, what Hitchens has pointed out here, I mean, really badly undermines. I mean, I wish he'd done the Jacobins too while he was at it, you know, but like, it really badly undermines one of Berlinsky's core examples from his opening statement of, you know, of atheism causes, you know, tyranny and murder, which you know, which is Hitler. So I really hope that Berlinsky doesn't respond to that with another, well, I already said that, you know, that religion can be bad.
Yeah, it does seem like that's just kind of his fallback for everything. He's like, well, you know, anything that you say is already covered in the first sentence of my opening statement. You know, like I already acknowledged that religion does poison some things. Anyway, back to my completely ahistorical claims about how atheism is responsible for Nazism.
Right. All right, let's keep going.
Proposition. First, the general proposition that atheism poisons everything. And second, the ancillary proposition that for sure religion poisons something. These propositions are not in conflict. And at the beginning of the discussion, I said they were in conflict. So asseverations to the contrary introduce into this discussion neither interesting evidence nor a valid argument. In terms of the social history of atheism, it seems to me, when I began this debate, and still seems to me now, overwhelmingly clear that while Nazism in Germany, communism in Russia, communism in China even, communism in Cambodia certainly had religious elements. Who would deny that? Why is that an interesting claim? The governing apparatus of ideology, no matter what Hitler had to say about his devotion to a warrior like Christ, involved the proposition among those who ruled these states and their entourage that no power was greater than their own. They acted on that proposition. They were restrained by nothing, and we saw the consequences. Now you may say, and perhaps say truly, that in their heart of hearts some Catholics adopted the rituals of the SS and took communion after an especially arduous day murdering innocent women in the fields of Poland. Could be true. I don't deny it.
Yeah, it is
But
true.
what
Like
we must
I don't,
ask
I
ourselves, if
truly
this is to be an intellectually
like. Is he expressing incredulity that like a true Christian could go hurt people en masse? Like how much time do you have? Like
Right.
yeah, and he even just said he's just like never mind what Hitler said or whatever. I know that secretly he was an atheist and motivated by atheism.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So it just doesn't count, that we can be sure that Robespierre, who was very publicly not an atheist, but since he rededicated, the Temple of, the Notre Dame Cathedral, that like we can be sure that, that he's atheist. But if like Hitler said like 100,000 super religious things, we could nevertheless be sure that, like obviously he was secretly an atheist. And not only was he secretly an atheist, but like that is what explains why he did what he did.
And just like his main argument on this point still seems to be that, well, atheism poisons our social and governmental structure because it eliminates any sort of higher power or higher authority, and these people acted like there was no higher authority. And as Hitchens, already pointed out and often pointed out, like people who think that they're being commanded by God to do something are willing to do terrible things as well. Like people who think there is a higher power and that God is telling them to do this, they have just as much confidence in doing just as awful things. It just doesn't seem like, either one of these very shorthand statements like, oh, without God, everything is permitted. And then it's like, okay, well, with God, a lot of things seem permissible as well because God is commanding you to do it, so it can't be wrong. I mean, there's obviously so much more to be said about that, but just these kind of one sentence, kind of like deepity about like, oh, well, they acted like there was no like higher authority. It's like, well, look, I have a one sentence response to that too. Now, do you want to actually have like a nuanced conversation about this issue or not? Or do you want to just keep doing what you're doing?
Yeah, and I mean it does go to how bad this like Berlinsky's responses are here, because if you just say, well, okay, religion poisons some things, but atheism poisons everything, which again, I don't know how to understand, I mean, to be fair, you can make the same point about Hitchens, religion poisons everything, but I don't know, I assume that Berlinsky doesn't quite mean that literally, right? I mean, does atheism poison calculus, right? Like whatever, but like, taking it as they say about Trump, seriously, but not literally. Like, I assume that atheism poisons everything means that like the consequences of atheism are way worse than like I don't know how else to interpret religion poisons some things, but atheism poisons everything. That the consequences of atheism are far worse than the consequences of religion. And then if you're further going to say one of my primary examples of atheism poison everything are the leaders of these regimes supposedly, not believing in a higher power that could judge them. Well, I mean, if the claim is that people are going to act worse in those positions of power if they don't believe in a higher power that could judge them, then surely things that religious people do in power are going to be very relevant to analyze, like adjudicating whether that's true or not, right? I mean, like that's like if you're going to say people are going to act worse in positions of power, right? Because they don't believe in God, then I mean, you've got to compare, at the very least, right? I mean, you've got to look at all of the bad things that that people who didn't believe in God did when they were in power, and also all the bad things that people who did believe in God did when they were in power. And then, like, I mean, you're obviously right. I mean, that shouldn't be the end of the conversation. You should then like start to ask harder questions about like why we think there's a causal connection and and all of that stuff. But like at the very least, you do need to look at all those things. And if it doesn't look like the record of atheists in power overall is worse than the record of religious people in power, then like that very badly undermines the original claim.
Yeah. I mean, and that little defense mechanism just doesn't help anything. Like everything you just said, it's not undermined by saying, well, I already granted that religion can poison some things. It's like, dude, you're the one who's saying that like atheists in power will behave worse. And then you cite these things that are not really attributable to atheism. And then you just deflect on everything, where religious people were involved in some atrocity. Like it's playing tennis without the net, as another new atheist would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd also say, by the way, this is a little bit snotty and it's a side point, but I do find that there is a certain kind of person who really likes to use the word proposition the way that he uses it here, right? Like who really likes to refer to claims as propositions and use phrases like ancillary proposition. It's like I don't know, last week, I think or the week before, I don't know, I was watching Jordan Peterson debating Kyle Berlinsky, and like the way that Peterson is saying, well, I don't believe that, that rights are a secondary derivative of the social contract. It's like, there's something about some of these turns of phrase that, I don't know. That seems like something that people do a lot if it's very important to them that everybody understand that they're smart.
Yeah, I think there was a 1,000,000% increase in the term presupposition after Jordan Peterson came on the scene. That was like a word that not a lot of people used until he showed up and started using it like in every other sentence.
Right. Exactly. All right, let's keep going.
The serious discussion is not whether there were infiltrations of religious thought in the worst tyrannies of mankind. Of course there were. That goes without saying. But whether something fundamental had changed in the diapason of thought that made these atrocities possible, and I say yes, there was. I've argued as well that atheism as a position has a deforming influence on science, and I've given you my reasons. Finally, I have argued that atheism, insofar as it removes from the human context a brute sense of obligation based on fear, removes from the moral calculus profound and powerful reason not to do evil. I think there's no escaping this. It's unpleasant. I don't particularly like it. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't lived my life that way, but I recognize it as a fact. And I think we all must. With that said, I thank you for listening.
I think he just said, without religion, a huge disincentive for bad behavior is removed. Now, does my own life reflect this? No, it does not.
Yeah, which is either a confession that like he's a monster, or else in his case, for some reason, it doesn't work that way.
He actually just accidentally gave a really good counter argument, where atheism doesn't poison this particular thing. It actually provides, good. Like it actually creates unique goods in the world that wouldn't exist. Is that a cuckoo clock?
Yes, that is in fact a cuckoo clock. Yes. Does not belong to me.
Oh yeah. I was distracted
It's
by
gone
the
off twice
cuckoo
before,
clock.
but one of them was when the opening music was going on, and then the other one was while we were watching. So this is the first time everybody else got to enjoy the cuckoo clock also.
I was a little distracted by the literal cuckoo clock there, but no, I was saying that atheism, there are unique goods in the world that only
Yeah.
exist because of atheism, and he kind of just admitted that, where he was saying like, well, if God doesn't exist, then there's not this big stick, that threatening you to be moral or whatever, and yet atheists are still moral. I mean, Hitler notwithstanding, a very famous atheist, Adolf Hitler, but I mean, setting him to one side, it's like atheists do good and they don't have an audience. They don't think they're going to be rewarded in the afterlife. And yet, they're still doing good things, and they don't think that there's anyone watching them, and they don't think they're going to be punished if they do bad things beyond the consequences that are offered by society that hold for, theists and atheists alike. So it's like there are unique goods as a consequence of atheism, because it's just a fact that atheists also do good things. They don't seem significantly less moral than theists. They seem to be just as moral/immoral as theists. And I mean, I think Hitchens might have pointed this out at some point as well, not in this debate, that in a way that does kind of make atheists more moral than
Right.
theists, because we're still doing similar things. We're still behaving in similar ways, but we don't have this big disincentive for bad behavior.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, at the very least, to the extent that you're sure that somebody's really an atheist, then that means that that takes off the table the thought that they're doing, they're doing what they're doing, like for non-moral reasons, right? That like at least to the extent that we're talking about things that aren't going to be punished by society or whatever, right? That somebody who's just doing something good, right? That they're not trying to that they're doing it because they think that it's good, rather than because they think that they're going to be rewarded for it or punished if they don't.
Yeah, I remember there was a rabbi who, I think it was in the early 19th century, who he said something about you should act like an atheist. Like when you see someone in need, you shouldn't say, "Oh, I'm going to pray for you," or "I hope God helps you," or God's will be done, or something. You should say, "If I don't help this person, no one will." Like you sort of act as if there is no God. Like
Right.
if I don't help this person, then no one is going to help this person. And I mean, that was his moral advice, was you should think like an atheist when you see people in need.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's keep going.
3 minutes.
Well, I think perhaps I can help close the gap a little, the gap that Professor Berlinsky complains of in my closing remarks. I came across a stray comment by George Orwell, of whom I'm a great admirer, in a little-known essay recently, in which he said, "At root, all totalitarianism must be theocratic." And I thought of my most admired author, that's rather stretching it. It's certainly possible to admire totalitarianism, to identify totalitarianisms that are not explicitly religious. He went on to clarify it a bit. He said, the reason I say it's theocratic is this: in all such dictatorships, there must be certain unchallengeable assumptions, some things that are beyond discussion, that are not available for debate, that must be taken as statements of faith. In other words, in Italy, for example, under fascism, il duce ha sempre ragione, the leader is always right. Of course, the cult of the Führer, the view that Stalin could bring 2 or 3 crops a year and was the great protector of the people, the worship of Mao, to take the other great element of the Axis powers, Japan, the emperor was actually a god. Couldn't have anything more theocratic than that, though he had secular appearance as well. Now, if you think of totalitarianism in that way, and if you think of that as the greatest poison, since I'm accused not of mentioning poison enough or stressing it enough, then you'll see that the charge that it is essentially theocratic is true because it depends upon unchallengeable statements, dogma, and faith. I don't know if anyone wants to name to me, or whether David will take up the challenge, a statement of atheism that is a statement purely of faith, independent of evidence, requiring no reasoning, and above all, punishable if challenged. I don't believe you can come up with anything of the sort. To the contrary, the little faction with which I'm honored to be identified as a junior member is adamant for doubt, is resolved to be skeptical, is certain only of the principle of uncertainty, and says that what we have yet to know is enormously greater than anything we have discovered or known so far, and that and only that is the test of education, of intellectual integrity, of honesty and inquiry, and yes, let's hope for it, the emancipation of humans from man-made, and I stress man-made, delusions, including hopeful ones, including false consolation. And
10 seconds.
Thus again, and I'll close by repeating myself, I've done worse. It is only those who claim to know things like the mind of God and the origins and destination and intention of the universe. It is they and only they who owe the explanation. And so far this evening, haven't cared to furnish it. Thank you.
We now move to the question and answer.
All right. Well, we usually skip Q&A on here. Yeah, I mean, I think that you said something earlier, which is probably worth underlining, that like, one thing that is really impressive about all of this is that, he's bald from chemotherapy and he keeps coughing, and he's, I think just on a pure performance level, just abstracted away from context, I think he's doing better and is much quicker on his feet than, even most people who do this would be.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's still more like rhetorically gifted and like cooler than I would be in this situation. Like, as he's dying of cancer and just in like perfect health, and I would still probably. Well, I mean, the other thing is, I couldn't help but turn it into like a more philosophical case. I would start like aping Paul Draper or something. I would not like make exactly the case that Hitchens does. I mean, partly because, I couldn't rhetorically, and because I'm not as historically knowledgeable as he is, but, I'm a lot more interested in the, philosophical issues surrounding God's existence, more so than any kind of activist consideration.
Yeah, and I think that Hitchens was obviously at his strongest when he was talking about either history or morality. I do tend to think he was at his weakest when he was when he was arguing. Well, certainly I think he was the weakest when he was arguing about the existence of God. That like in a strange sort of way, he almost didn't seem to care very much about that. Like he always made it clear that he would didn't think there was sufficient evidence to believe in a God, but I mean, like it always felt to me like when he was in debates about religion and like the arguments for the existence of God came up, that he always felt a little impatient to like go on. It's like no, but I really want to do the like sort of humanistic moral critique of religion. Let's get to that part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, he was more concerned with like the practical issues about religion. And I mean, when he was debating William Lane Craig, I think the consensus is generally that he did not do so well when he was confronted with the more like philosophical, like philosophically rigorous approach. And I've also heard kind of like third or fourth hand that he was absolutely trashed before that debate even started. Like the student who picked him up from the airport has like, I've like heard this like through like a chain of people, is like he was really, really drunk even when they picked him up from the airport before the debate even started.
Yeah, I'll buy that. I mean, he, like, some of his demeanor, especially in the part where he and Craig ask each other questions, does feel a little bit like that. It's always hard to tell. I would assume that, days where he had partaken not at all were probably rare, but they have but like, I think there's a range, and he does, and yeah, he does seem, yeah, I think that's plausible. I should say it is really, and God, I mean, even now, maybe, right? Like in this debate we're watching from 2010, right? That like he has. I remember, there's this book. They do these for a bunch of people, but there was one for Hitchens. It's the last interview and other interviews. So it's like just this little collection of interviews that includes the last one he gave before he died. And leading up to that, right, there's a profile of him. I do not remember who by, but that was, during, as you said earlier, Chrome Dome Hitchens era. And, and it's like a pretty good profile. It's like very well written, the stuff about the, Hitchens, in the state that he's in here, staying up and watching the sunrise and stuff like that. But like, the really funny part of it is that the guy brought a bottle of wine with him to the interview, because he's like, okay, look, surely he's not drinking whiskey anymore, but like, maybe he'll at least have a glass of wine. And when he got there, Hitchens said, "Oh, great, right? Because I feel bad. I felt bad because I wasn't gonna have any wine to offer you because I'm out." Then he pours himself a slug of Johnny Walker Black, and he's like, "Wait, you're still doing that? Like while you're chemotherapy, all this stuff?" And he was like, "Well, none of my doctors told me I had to stop." It's like, okay. I suspect he didn't bring up the suggestion, when he's talking to the doctors.
Yeah, I'm sure he didn't ask. He was just like waiting for them not to say anything. But I swear, I think you wrote about this, but I'm curious if you think he would have been a Bernie bro. I know that everyone, like, they love to project their own political views. Oh, Hitchens would have supported Trump. He would have supported Hillary. But I mean, I do kind of suspect he would have been a Bernie bro.
Yeah, I think he might have been. I think that, try to be, look at this objectively. I think the one thing that I actually do feel like we can rule out with some certainty is Trump, because not just because the very few comments he'd ever made about Trump were like, was this one thing on C-SPAN where he says, like, Brian Lamb asked him something about Trump, and he says, "Oh God," and then it's like, the only, as far as I've ever been able to tell, the only impressive thing about Donald Trump is that he's found a way to cover 90% of his skull with 10% of his hair. But, and then in a column for The Nation during the 2000 election, when, I mean, it's kind of funny that everybody's completely forgotten about this, but in 2000, Trump was like, I don't know that he was ever officially on any ballot or whatever, but he was like at least considering publicly running for the Reform Party nomination, right? So it's like the guy who 20 years later would actually be president of the United States, was also ran for like a third party nomination. But in his column about that race, Hitchens says that just describes him as a nutball narcissistic tycoon. And as somebody pointed out in the chat, actually, like, some of his comments about Ross Perot, I think, could probably be transposed onto Trump. But so I think he clearly, like, intensely disliked Donald Trump as a person. But I think even more so, I think just like all the stuff that Trump stood for. I mean, I think that, like, Hitchens at his absolute political worst still, would find pretty vile, right? Like again, I think if you look at some of what he wrote and said about the Tea Party and, Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin, all of this stuff, I just really don't see any grounds for thinking that he would have been a Trump guy. Now, he did also hate the Clintons very much. So, think that the range of possibilities would include him just sort of being pox on all their houses about it, which is actually what he was a Nader guy in the 2000 election. He could have reverted to something like that. But as far as the primary goes, again, I don't know. I think some of his late in life foreign policy positions would have, static between him and the sort of young Bernie people. But and I certainly can't imagine him saying anything nice about Jeremy Corbyn. But Bernie, I actually think it's possible that he would have supported, because if you, I think certainly some of the sort of core economic points, I don't think he ever completely gave up, right? I think if you look at some of what he wrote very late, I think that the idea that economic inequality on a huge scale is bad and worrying, right? Is still definitely in the mix. And then I think the thing that probably and then again, he did always really hate, the Clintons, so that would have helped too. And hated them for the right reasons, right? If you read his book, No One Left to Lie To, about Bill Clinton, he talks about welfare reform and, a lot of other things like that in there, healthcare. But I think probably the biggest thing that makes me think that he might have at least said some nice things about Bernie in the election, possibly even unambiguously supported him, is that moment in the 2016 Democratic debates where I talk about this at the beginning of the book, where it's where Hillary brags that Henry Kissinger is this super good friend of hers. And
yeah,
Bernie,
she touted his endorsement as she's I was endorsed by Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. And Bernie's I'm proud to say Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I have to think that as somebody who spent decades obsessed with hating Kissinger, that would have gotten him some points from Hitchens.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a negative and positive case that he would have been a Bernie bro. First off, just by process of elimination, the idea that he would have supported Hillary, he's got such a huge track record of criticizing the Clintons, like you said, for the right reasons. He knew why they were bad. And also just the idea that he would have supported an illiterate billionaire, or at least multimillionaire. It's just, those are both so unbelievable and so out of line with his values. And then with Bernie, Bernie does kind of win by elimination, but also Bernie does seem in line with his professed values. The rejection of the anti-endorsement of Kissinger, but also Hitchens never really abandoned his socialist beliefs or his left-wing economic convictions, as far as I can tell. It seemed like he just thought that socialism kind of withered on the vine, but it's not like he actually stopped thinking that. It's not like his critique of capitalism or his defense of socialism really changed. He just thought that socialism kind of withered, at least that's what he talked about it kind of mournfully,
No, I think that's exactly right. He stopped being a socialist in the sense that he gave up on the thought that it was ever going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
But he didn't think that was a good thing, that it was never going to happen. So yeah,
exactly. I feel like Bernie, it would have rekindled something. And I can't help but think he would have been a Bernie bro.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. Like I said, I think that I think pro-Trump or pro-Brexit or anything like that, absolutely not. And I think that there's a range of possibilities that definitely includes, that definitely includes him being a Bernie bro in 2016, which, as much as I would like to think it, I also think that it might actually be true. So, I don't think that's pure wishful thinking. I think that there's a plausible scenario where that would have happened. All right. Well, hey, really enjoyed this. Emerson, where can people check out your stuff?
You can. Sorry, there was just a loud noise outside my apartment. But
I didn't hear any cuckoo clocks going out over there.
So you can check out the Emerson Green YouTube channel, and as you mentioned at the beginning, I have two podcasts, one called Walden Pod and one called Counter Apologetics. I started off just making those two podcasts, and then I eventually started uploading them on YouTube. So that's why there's kind of the It's kind of spread out among platforms and stuff. But yeah, Counter Apologetics and Walden Pod. And on YouTube, I just have the Emerson Green YouTube channel, and they all kind of find their way there. But I'm at Walden Pod on Twitter, and yeah, that's about it.
Fair enough.
Thank you so much for having me on, by the way. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, this is great. We should absolutely do this again.
Yeah.
All right. So we are going to be back on Monday. I'm not 100% sure. I think we might unlock the Rick Perlstein interview that patrons got a little while back. So look forward to that. See people then. Thanks again, Emerson. Left is best.